Following the unrest, lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, as Carrie mentioned, are calling for the removal of President Trump. Some say he incited the violence, and besides the impeachment, they also want to invoke that 25th Amendment.
It really is not designed to remove a president for the reasons that people are thinking of now. Those reasons are really designed more for impeachment.
And we talked with a local professor about what could happen. Now, the 25th Amendment provides the procedures for replacing the president or vice president in the event of death, removal, resignation, or incapacitation. There's also a clause that addresses if a president could become physically or mentally unable to perform their duties. In that circumstance, the vice president would assume those powers. It would take a vote from the vice president and the full cabinet to decide if President Trump is no longer mentally capable to be president. But even if that happens, the president himself could challenge it.
He can dispute the findings of being unable, and that goes to Congress then to decide. And unless Congress, by a 2/3 vote, decides against him, he would receive his powers back.
What's up, guys? Welcome back. Adam is here, so this is what's happening right now. For the first time, Trump's own hand-picked cabinet is actively exploring the 25th Amendment, not opposition politicians, not protesters. His own people, 8 or more cabinet officials, the exact threshold needed, holding clandestine conversations about declaring him mentally unfit to serve. And the most destabilizing detail, he knows. The paranoia is consuming him. He's flooding Truth Social with manic denials while simultaneously purging anyone he suspects of disloyalty.
If the United States Congress has any life left in it, every member of Congress and senator must be calling for Trump's removal today based on the 25th Amendment. He is threatening the entire destruction of a civilization. He is calling Iranians animals. He is showing a total disregard for the humanity of people in Iran, in Gaza, in Cuba. This is a moral crime. It is a war crime. We need to be demanding that Congress convene today, and we need to be invoking the 25th Amendment.
The entire executive branch has become a hall of mirrors, and every shadow looks like someone coming for his job. What makes this so historically breathtaking is that we are moving past the slow, grinding machinery of impeachment. For years, the national conversation has been dominated by the I word, the tedious process of House votes, Senate trials, and partisan tribal warfare. But the 25th Amendment is a different beast entirely. It is a switchblade to impeachment's broadsword.
At Capitol Hill, where lawmakers are seriously considering impeaching President Trump for a second time. And by now, you probably heard these words, 25th Amendment and impeachment being tossed around. But how do they actually work? And what's the likelihood of either one happening? Hope Ford explains.
I joined the Senate Democratic leader in calling on the Vice President to remove this president by immediately invoking the 25th Amendment.
The 25th Amendment, a way of stripping a sitting president of power and giving it to the Vice President.
If the Vice President and the Cabinet do not act, the Congress may be prepared to move forward with impeachment.
Impeachment, a way of removing a sitting president, has been used against 3 presidents, including President Trump. Here's the difference. For impeachment, it's a slower process, and while House Democrats have the power to start the process, it would need the support of Republicans. 18 Republican senators would have to vote to impeach Trump. Republicans like Mitt Romney, who was the only Republican to vote to impeach Trump in 2020, have already said time may be too short for that.
We are talking about a scenario where the very people who work for the president, the secretaries and administrators who occupy the massive offices just down the hall from the Resolute desk, are looking at each other with grim expressions and saying that the boss has lost his grip on reality. They don't just think he's making bad policy choices or veering too far right on trade deals. They think he is psychologically unraveling. They believe he is a danger to the Republic not because of his ideology, but because of his volatile, compulsion-driven mental state that drives him to abuse power capriciously and viciously. This isn't a threat from the opposing party, it's a verdict from his own kitchen cabinet. The sheer immediacy of the 25th Amendment is what makes it such an existential nightmare for Trump. There is no lengthy trial. There is no requirement for the Senate to hobble together a filibuster-proof supermajority. The amendment operates with the swiftness of a palace coup. The moment the vice president and a simple majority of the cabinet secretaries sign a written declaration that the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, the power transfer occurs with the stroke of a pen. Right there, in that millisecond, the president becomes a private citizen stripped of his authority, and the vice president is sworn in as the acting president immediately. Boom. Done. That's what the insiders are murmuring about in the hallways of Washington right now, and according to the chatter, Trump is absolutely petrified. He has reportedly been cornering aides, griping that they are trying to 25th him, demanding absolute fealty, and threatening that anyone who wobbles will find themselves fired and publicly humiliated. This isn't leadership. This is an animal backed into a corner, clawing at the walls. Why is this happening now? Why are the floodgates of internal revolt breaking open at this precise moment in time? It's because the cabinet secretaries are not blind. They are witnessing the total collapse of the firewall that traditionally protects a president from accountability. They see the cascade of crushing courtroom defeats, including the judge who looked the president in the eye and held him in contempt for flagrantly smashing court orders into pieces. They see the mass exodus of the legal defense team, the attorneys who walked away from the table because the client had become radioactive and unmanageable. They see the impeachment proceedings grinding forward, fueled by new evidence of misconduct. They see the resurfacing of the deeply disturbing Epstein connections and the grotesque piggy comment that ignited a firestorm of disgust among female voters and civilized people generally. They see the chaotic bloodletting where dozens of staffers were shown the door simply for being suspected of leaking bad news. The cumulative weight of this moral and legal decay is crushing their resolve to remain complicit. These cabinet members have their own reputations to protect. They are looking at their careers in the rearview mirror and asking themselves a brutal question. Do I really want my obituary to say I was the loyal servant who enabled the destruction of the Constitution just to stay in a job for another 6 months? The answer for a growing number of them is a hard, unequivocal no. They believe he has crossed the line from acceptable political combat into a realm of instability that renders him a national security liability. And so, the discussions have begun, hesitant at first, then louder, moving from encrypted texts to hushed, in-person meetings where the safety of the republic is weighed against the political toxicity of action. Vice President J.D. Vance has stepped into the void with a public denial, issuing a cold, sterile statement claiming there is absolutely no action taking place under the 25th Amendment and that the president is in total command of the ship of state. But nobody inside the intelligence ecosystem is buying that sanitized propaganda for a second. Insiders are scorching Vance's denial, calling it a panicked, frantic exercise in damage control designed to calm the markets and prevent an immediate constitutional flashpoint. They are painting a portrait of a vice president who is petrified of the implications of success. Because if the 25th Amendment succeeds, Vance becomes the most powerful man in the world, but he inherits a poisoned chalice guarded by an enraged base that will brand him a backstabbing traitor for the rest of his natural life. If the attempt fails, he is politically dead, exiled from the movement as a treacherous snake. Vance is trapped in an impossible geometry of ambition and self-preservation, trying to hold back the tidal wave of cabinet anxiety while simultaneously distancing himself from the sinking ship. He is trying to project normalcy, but the structural framework of the government is creaking under the pressure. The FBI is circling, running active investigations into the administration's compliance with court edicts, probing criminal referrals that edge closer and closer to the Oval Office. The contempt citations are stacking up like unpaid parking tickets, except they carry the threat of federal prison time. The impeachment gears in the House keep grinding. And in the midst of this hurricane, the silent procedural mechanism of the 25th Amendment sits there, far deadlier than any impeachment jury because it relies not on public evidence, but on the private, witnessed fear of the men and women working alongside the president. To truly grasp the gravity of this moment, you have to understand the architecture of the 25th Amendment itself, because most of the country has been sleepwalking through the specifics. We tend to think of impeachment as the only ejection button, but that's a political process, slow and poisoned by partisanship. The 25th Amendment, ratified in the shadow of the Kennedy assassination when the government realized it needed a protocol for sudden incapacitation, is a direct line to the presidency. Section 4 specifically is the weapon of choice here. It doesn't require a physical ailment or a coma. It requires the vice president and a simple majority of the principal officers of the executive departments, 8 out of the 15 official cabinet secretaries, to transmit to the president pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House their written declaration that the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. The language is ambiguous enough to cover mental unfitness and psychological instability. It only needs these 16 people to make a judgment call that the boss can no longer function. There is no waiting period for a transition of power. It is instantaneous. The vice president immediately assumes the role of acting president, and the former president's only recourse is to send a counter-declaration stating that no inability exists, throwing the final decision to Congress for a vote within a strictly limited time frame. That is the knife that is currently being sharpened behind closed doors. The cabinet members are looking at the objective conduct, the screaming late-night posts, the transparently illegal defiance of judicial decrees, the firings of competent officials based purely on paranoid fantasies, and the vulgar, dehumanizing comments. And they are quietly applying the standard of unfitness. The beauty and the horror of the 25th Amendment is that the bar is fundamentally lower than impeachment's high crimes and misdemeanors. You don't need to prove a quid pro quo with a foreign power or an obstruction charge that would hold up in a jury trial. You simply need to demonstrate, to the satisfaction of the people who see him every day in the Situation Room, that the president is psychologically incapable of managing the peace, the economy, and the nuclear codes. And there is a devastatingly logical, articulate argument to be made right now that Trump ticks every box on the unfitness checklist. His patterns of behavior, the wild paranoia that sees treason in the eyes of loyal aides, the inability to control his impulses in a courtroom or on a video recording, the casual willingness to shred the Constitution to protect his ego, these are not the signs of a stable executive. The case for the 25th Amendment is that these actions constitute a dereliction of mental fitness, but herein lies the immense gut-wrenching risk that is making the cabinet hesitate. Invoking the 25th is the nuclear option of constitutional law. It has never, ever been done before. There is no playbook. If the cabinet signs those papers, they are effectively staging a lightning-speed intervention on the most powerful human on Earth, and Trump will not go quietly. He would launch a counteroffensive of legal filings and media warfare that would make the Capitol riot look like a picnic. He would scream deep state coup until his veins burst. He would turn half the country into a furious, volatile mob that views the acting President Vance as an illegitimate usurper. And that's why the cabinet members are weighing the pros and cons with trembling hands. They know that pulling this trigger could save the constitutional order, or it could plunge the country into a domestic conflict we haven't seen since the Civil War. The psychological warfare inside the administration is now public knowledge. The very fact that Trump is purging staff in a wild, swinging frenzy is direct evidence that the threat is real. When you fire 40 staffers in one sweep, you aren't just streamlining an organization. You are desperately trying to plug a dam that has 1,000 leaks. Cabinet secretaries are watching these firings with sheer terror in their eyes, realizing that loyalty offers no shield. If a Secretary of State or Defense sees a junior staffer axed merely for a suspicious glance, they start doing the math on their own survival. The message being sent by the purges is brutally clear. You are not a colleague, you are a hostage. And if you think pulling the 25th lever is dangerous, imagine the danger of staying put and being dragged into an FBI probe or a contempt charge. The staff purge has backfired spectacularly because it has created an atmosphere of such suffocating toxicity that even the most ambitious, power-hungry cabinet officials are wondering if the job description has changed from advise the president to risk your law license and possibly your freedom. When the FBI is actively knocking on doors and issuing criminal referrals, the calculus shifts from political survival to personal survival. Cabinet members are starting to think like witnesses. They want to be on the right side of history, not just the right side of a red hat. They are looking at the door and realizing that the 25th Amendment might be the only way to walk out of the White House in handcuffs versus walking out under mutual indictment. We are essentially watching the moment where the Republican coalition begins to rationalize jumping ship. This is a dual constitutional meltdown, a perfect storm where impeachment and the 25th Amendment are no longer separate tracks, but are merging into a single, roaring, high-speed derailment. You have the House impeaching, the Senate waiting, and the Cabinet actively considering preempting the Senate entirely. Think about the humiliation of that scenario, being fired by your own employees before the opposition party can finish firing you. For Trump, that is the ultimate existential terror, because it destroys the narrative that this is all a partisan witch hunt. You cannot call it a Democratic coup when it's your own Republican vice president and your own Republican-appointed cabinet holding the pen. The overlapping nature of these crises is accelerating the timeline. Every contempt ruling strengthens the case for mental incapacity. Every FBI subpoena strengthens the whisper campaign against the president's stability. Every poll showing a cratering approval rating among suburban women gives political cover to cabinet members who think they might survive the political fallout of a removal vote. Trump's inner monologue must be deafening right now. He built his entire identity on being the ultimate boss, the "you're fired" guy, and now his underlings are rehearsing the lines to fire him, for cause, citing insanity. Trump is fighting back the only way he knows how, by broadcasting rage. He will claim it's a conspiracy. He will say the amendment is being weaponized. He will threaten to primary every single cabinet member's future political ambitions. But here is the brutal reality check for him. He is running out of tools. You can fire a staffer, but you can't fire a constitutional process. You can post on social media, but you can't obstruct a VP and 8 secretaries walking a letter to the Senate rostrum. If the 25th Amendment detonates, the political physics of 2024 rearrange themselves into a black hole. We are looking at a situation where, within minutes of the signatures being recorded, the impeachment trial in the Senate becomes a ghost proceeding. If Trump is no longer the sitting president, what do you do with the impeachment? Do you press forward to bar a private citizen from future office, or does the entire effort dissolve into a historical footnote? Senate Republicans, who are already terrified of their base, would face an impossible vote. Do they convict a man who is already dethroned, potentially martyring him further and provoking a backlash from his loyalists? Or do they let him linger as a zombie candidate, able to stand for election again? The confusion would be absolute, and that confusion is what cabinet members might be betting on to reset the board. They are thinking that if they can just get Vance seated in the Oval Office for even a few hours, the institutional inertia shifts. The military salutes the new chain of command. The Secret Service adjusts its protection posture. The world leaders start calling the new guy. By the time Trump's lawyers try to file an emergency appeal, the architecture of power has already moved on. That's the logic of the coup or the rescue mission, depending on which side of the resigning letter you stand on. Vance's denials are likely strategic. He can't be seen as coveting the throne, so he must play the part of the dutiful, horrified servant right up until the moment he accepts the transfer of authority. His statement of denial is standard operating procedure in a silent war. You deny until the trigger is pulled, and then you pivot to solemn duty. The sheer weight of this moment connects back to the Nixonian twilight, but with darker, more volatile undertones. When Nixon's cabinet finally came to him, led by Barry Goldwater, they told him the gig was up in private. They didn't have to use a procedural amendment. Nixon was sane enough to read the room and feel the shame. He resigned to avoid the disgrace of removal. That elegant, somber exit is a luxury this administration does not possess. There is zero chance of a selfless resignation here, no rose garden speech admitting fault for the good of the nation. Trump's psychology isn't wired that way. He views surrender not just as failure, but as death. So the cabinet cannot rely on shame. They have to rely on the clinical cruelty of Section 4. They have to treat this like an intervention for a patient who doesn't know he's sick. That requires a level of cold-blooded nerve that is rare in political history. The cabinet members are terrified not just of Trump, but of the MAGA base that views any removal as a declaration of war. They are trying to gauge whether their own personal security is worth the risk. They are looking at the FBI investigations, hoping that the Bureau will produce a silver bullet, an indictment so airtight that it gives them political cover to act, making the removal look like a sad necessity rather than a power grab. The criminal referrals from the courts are the jet fuel for this fire. If the DOJ or FBI signals that the president is an unindicted co-conspirator in crimes related to obstruction of justice or violation of court orders, moving against him stops being a question of psychology and becomes a question of legality. The sheer dysfunction of the current environment means the government is essentially running on fumes. This isn't a functioning executive branch anymore. It is a war room for self-preservation. Cabinet secretaries who should be focused on global inflation, pandemic readiness, and military strategy are instead running a silent straw poll on whether their boss is sane. Every meeting in the West Wing is now a psychological profiling session. People are watching his hands shake, his voice crack, his eyes dart around the room, wondering if today is the day he finally snaps completely. The piggy comment and the Epstein associations are the rotting cherries on top of a melting sundae. They strip away the dignity of the office, making it easier for a cabinet secretary to go home to their spouse and say, "I cannot defend that man another day." When you lose the moral high ground so completely, the psychological barrier to invoking removal mechanisms gets much, much thinner. It becomes a rescue mission for the country, rather than a betrayal of a boss. The female vote is gone. The suburban vote is cratered, and cabinet members know that associating too closely with a sinking ship of vulgarity is a one-way ticket to a failed primary challenge or a lost general election. The math is simple. Stay with him and drown in investigations, or remove him and risk the wrath of a digital mob. But the digital mob doesn't have subpoena power. The FBI does. As we hurtle toward the conclusion of this chapter, the sense of inevitability is crushing. Trump's options are narrowing to a pinhole. He can't fire enough people to stop the fear. The purges, which were meant to consolidate his iron grip, have acted like a razor wire that is cutting his own administration to ribbons. The cabinet members are acting like hostages who have found an escape hatch in the Constitution, and they are whispering the combination to each other in the dead of night. Impeachment pressures them from the outside. The 25th Amendment is the pressure cooker waiting to blow from the inside. It creates a dual constitutional crisis that is unprecedented in the American story. The Senate is one arena, the cabinet room is another, and Trump is losing in both simultaneously. The entire system, judicial, legislative, and now the executive's own internal immune response, is rejecting the host. And as the walls close in, the paranoia will only deepen, leading to more erratic behavior, more firings, and more evidence for the cabinet that the mental decline is accelerating. It's a death spiral of constitutional proportion. We are not just heading into uncharted waters. The map itself is on fire, and the captain is locked in his quarters screaming at the walls. The 25th Amendment is the battering ram, and the men and women holding it are standing outside the door, counting to 3. So buckle up, because the internal revolt is not a possibility anymore. It is an active operation unfolding in real time, and the resolution is going to rewrite the very definition of American executive power for the next 100 years.